All right, so today we're going to start with our basic techniques of watercolor. And first I'm going to go over the materials just a little bit. Here's my palette. I have sprayed water on all of my paint to get it activated. Here is my elephant ear sponge, and I have already put it in water to get it damp. Squeeze it out so it's just damp. These are my basic tools. This is our 1-inch flat wash brush. This is a sponge wash. I'll show you how to use this. This is a big watercolor round. This is natural hair, and this is a smaller watercolor round. This is the brush that is in the kit. These two brushes are in the watercolor supply kit. And you can see this one comes to a very nice point in here. These brushes are a combination of natural hair, which is squirrel hair, and synthetic fiber. And then this is a sable brush, which holds a lot of water. So the first thing we're going to do is to practice the wash. The wash is the basic technique that watercolor is built on, and that means that we're going to lay an area of color over the paper. A flat wash means it is flat, it doesn't vary in tone or color, and there are two ways to do it. There is wet into wet and there's wet on dry. So the first thing we're going to do is wet a piece of area of the paper down a little, and we can do this with the flat wash brush. We can do it with the sponge brush. A sponge brush is really easy to lay down water. Like that. I would do the same thing with a flat brush. I would take water and just lay it down on the surface here. So I'm letting the water soak into the paper a little bit. And this is our student grade paper. This is Fabriano student grade paper. And I'm letting it soak in just a little bit. Remove that hair so it's not, loses a little bit of the shine on there. And then for our flat wash, this is because the surface is wet, and I'm going to take wet paint. This is called wet into wet. I'll take our blue paint here. This is our ultramarine blue. And we're going to So this is an example of a wet into wet wash, flat wash. A wet on dry wash, where the paper is dry first and then we add the wet paint to it, looks a little bit different. And see if you can figure out why it is different. So we have in both areas we have a fairly smooth application of paint, but notice how the color is stronger here and the edges are sharper here. And that's because the wet surface up here grabs the pigment and disperses it and gives it a softer edge. Here the paint only goes where the water goes, so the color is a little bit brighter. It's not as diluted as with the water, extra water in the paper up here, and our edges are sharper. So this is the difference between wet into wet and wet on dry. So you have a softer edge. There are times when you are going to want a softer wash, say in background tones, background areas, when you're modeling a rounded form, but then there are times that you want a hard edge and a stronger wash when you're dealing with flat surfaces or foreground objects, geometric forms that have hard edges. So you want to practice the washes with both applications, both wet into wet and wet on dry. And next we're going to do a graded wash. I'm going to flip the paper around here. And the graded wash, that means that we're moving from one value to the next. Here you can see I'm doing it wet on dry. I want to get more paint, a little less water here. And then as I want to move it into a little different value tone, I'm going to add more water and less paint. I soak out some of the water with my brush. So you can see that it moves from dark to light. So it's a gradation in tone. And then a variegated wash moves from one color to another color. So I'm going to put a lot of blue in here. And I'm going to add another color over here. So we have our washes moving from one color to the other color. So we overlap the colors a little bit as they move into one, as they merge into one color, from one color into another. So there are three basic kinds of wash: the flat wash, the graded wash, and the variegated wash, and two different approaches, the wet on dry and the wet into wet. And just to remind you what the difference is between wet into wet and wet on dry, I'm going to take my round brush here. I'm just going to put this is wet on dry, so I'm going to get a harder edge with the brush strokes. You can see how the edges are hard around here, little crisp edges. Then over here, this is a wet surface. You see how the water pulls that pigment and disperses it. So I get a soft edge, not a hard edge. And you have to remember, what kind of effect do you want when you're painting? If you want it soft, you want to work with wet into wet, and that's the best way to work background tones. And if you want a hard edge, crisp detail, you want to work wet on dry.